What if I told you the most feared warriors in ancient history were not forged on the battlefield, but in a system so brutal it began at birth? In Sparta, a child could survive war, but not a crooked ankle. A mother could endure labor in silence, but not grieve in public. Boys were starved so they would learn to steal, then beaten for being caught. At a sacred altar, children were whipped until their blood soaked into stone while their parents stood watching. And far beyond the temples and training grounds, in the darkness of the countryside, thousands of enslaved men believed courage would buy them freedom until they vanished without a trace. This is not the legend of the 300 at Thermopylae. This is the machinery behind them, a society that declared war on its own slaves every year. A civilization that shaved brides, broke children, weaponized mothers, and called it honor. A city with no walls because it did not need them. Fear was its fortress. Punishment was its foundation. Tonight, we dismantle the myth. We uncover what ancient writers recorded, what archaeology revealed, and what history tried to soften. Because the real question is not how Sparta defeated its enemies, but how far it went to control its own people. Stay with me. The truth at the end will change the way you see strength forever.
They came on the third dawn, silent, official, unstoppable. A mother learned that in Sparta, love was not private, it was illegal. And before the child was given a name, the state decided if he deserved to breathe. Agiotis was 20 and already trained to suffer without witnesses. In Sparta, pain was not a misfortune, it was a test, and tests were meant to be passed in silence. When the labor came, she did what Spartan law expected. She did not cry out, did not beg for help, did not shame her household with weakness. The stone walls held her breath like a prison holds a confession. Outside, the Eurotas ran low beneath a punishing summer, olive groves on the slopes of Taygetus turning brittle and pale, as if the land itself was learning discipline. When the child finally arrived, a boy, alive and furious with breath, Agiotis pressed him to her chest and felt something Sparta warned women to fear: attachment. Not to a husband, not to comfort, but to a helpless thing that could be taken. For 3 days she lived in a fragile illusion. She fed him, watched his small fists clench and unclench, traced the shadow of his eyelashes in lamplight, as if memorizing a face the world might erase. She did not name him. In Sparta, a baby was not named until the city accepted him. The state did not like citizens who belonged to anyone first. It did not like mothers who believed their bodies created life. The city believed it created life. Women were merely the furnace. That was the bargain. Exercise through pregnancy, eat what you were told, harden your body so the fruit would be worthy. Give Sparta soldiers, or be remembered as a failure no one speaks of directly, only with narrowed eyes and fewer invitations to sacred rites. On the third day, the door opened without permission. 2 elders entered as if the threshold belonged to them, because it did. They were men of the Gerousia, old enough that their faces seemed carved from the same limestone as the temples. They did not greet her like a mother. They did not look at her like a human being. Their gaze moved past her, toward the swaddled bundle, the way a craftsman looks at raw material. Agiotis stood against the far wall, still as a statue. She knew the rules. No protest, no pleading, no reaching. The moment you clutched your child like yours, you exposed yourself as disloyal. They unwrapped the boy under the thin window light. Fingers pressed along his spine, hands stretched his limbs. The elder tilted the tiny body, turned him as if checking a weapon for flaws. The baby cried, strong, angry, alive. Agiotis felt relief rise like a forbidden prayer. Then the elder's hand paused at the left foot. He rotated it slowly, clinically, with a patience so cold it felt religious. His colleague watched without expression. A fraction of a second passed, nothing dramatic, no shouted verdict, no theatrical cruelty, just a look between two men trained to detect deviation the way hunters detect blood on wind. The ankle turned inward, not broken, not grotesque, simply not perfect. The elder spoke one word, and it landed heavier than any spear: unfit. In other cities, a flaw might mean a harder life. In Sparta, it meant removal. The logic was presented as mercy. Why let an imperfect child suffer in a society that demanded perfection? But mercy in Sparta was only another mask for control. Agiatis did not move. Her mouth stayed closed. Her hands remained at her sides. Inside her chest, something broke and tried to scream. Yet even grief had rules. A mother who mourned a rejected infant was saying her private love outranked the public good, and that was not sorrow, that was treason. They wrapped the boy again and carried him out as if transporting a decision, not a child. Agiatis followed to the doorway, but no farther. The morning air struck her skin like punishment. She watched their backs as they walked the path toward Taygetus, the mountain that loomed above Sparta like an altar and an executioner, visible from every street, every courtyard, every life. The baby's cry thinned with distance, swallowed by wind, until the valley sounded normal again. That was Sparta's greatest trick, to make horror feel like routine. Agiatis stood in her empty house, arms aching with a weight that was no longer there. She could not ask where they would leave him, because questions were dangerous. She could not tell anyone what she felt, because feelings were evidence. And yet, while the city expected her to become stone, something else began to form in her mind, an insect of doubt, crawling beneath the polished myth. Because Taygetus did not only take infants, it took criminals, it took prisoners, it took men who disappointed the state. And somewhere on that mountain, beneath cold rocks and older shadows, the truth waited, about what unfit really meant, and why Sparta needed mothers like Agiatis to stay silent. But before we follow the elders to the base of the mountain, you need to understand something darker. In Sparta, punishment wasn't what happened after you broke the rules. Punishment was how the rules were made. And the child's inspection was only the first lesson. Sparta feared no foreign army, only the shadows inside its own borders. So it built a society where punishment came before crime. And the mountain above the city was not scenery, it was a warning. To understand why a newborn's twisted ankle could become a death sentence, you must understand the fear that ruled Sparta more completely than any king. Sparta did not tremble at Persia or Athens. It trembled at the sound of its own soil shifting beneath too many feet. The Spartans were not the majority in their own land. They were a military elite perched atop a population they had conquered generations earlier. The Helots, men, women, and children who worked the fields, harvested the grain, and fed the warriors who called themselves masters. Ancient writers like Herodotus described the imbalance with uneasy clarity. The Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens many times over, perhaps 7 to 1, perhaps more. Sparta was a blade balanced on a thin edge, sharp but fragile, surrounded by those who had every reason to hate it. Fear became policy, insecurity became law, and punishment became architecture. The geography amplified the psychology. Sparta sat exposed in a valley without defensive walls, flanked by the mountains of Taygetus to the west and Parnon to the east. Later generations praised this as supreme confidence, claiming Spartan men were walls enough. But a city without walls is also a city without privacy.
There is no place to hide dissent, no corner where sorrow can be whispered without risk. The mountains enclose the valley like the rim of a stone bowl. Taygetus, in particular, loomed like a judge, its ridges visible from every road, its slopes absorbing generations of secrets. When elders carried Agyatis's son toward its heights, they were not improvising cruelty, they were following a ritual embedded in the landscape. The mountain was part of the system. It watched, it reminded, it promised consequences. Sparta's rulers asked one question obsessively: how do we prevent revolt? The Helot uprisings, especially the Great Rebellion after the earthquake of 464 BCE, had shaken the city to its foundation. Ancient historian Thucydides records how the ground split and buildings fell, and in that moment of chaos, the Helots saw opportunity. Sparta survived, but survival hardened into paranoia. Every institution was redesigned, not to promote happiness or trade or art, but to ensure obedience. Boys would be taken at 7 and molded into soldiers. Women would be trained to produce strong sons and shame weak men. Meals would be communal, so no one ate in secret. Even speech was regulated through custom and expectation. Deviation was not corrected, it was erased. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, whether a single man or a myth woven from centuries of reform, became the symbol of this transformation. Plutarch, writing centuries later, described Sparta as a perpetual military camp where no man lived as he pleased. Citizens belonged to the state more completely than property. Their bodies were inventory. Their endurance was investment. The absence of walls was not bravery, it was exposure by design. In a city where everyone could see you, reputation became a weapon. Shame could travel faster than any decree. The system thrived on social annihilation. A coward was not merely criticized, he was isolated, denied conversation, forced to yield his place in public gatherings. His daughters might remain unmarried. His name became a lesson. Fear fed greed. Sparta's entire way of life depended on Helot labor. The Spartan citizen trained for war because someone else tilled the earth. That dependency was humiliating in a culture obsessed with dominance. To mask it, the state ritualized terror. Each year, the ephors formally declared war on the Helots, a legal maneuver that allowed any Spartan to kill a Helot without religious pollution. Murder became policy. Young men were sometimes sent into the countryside in what later sources called the crypteia, moving at night, killing the strongest or most outspoken Helots to thin potential resistance. Whether every detail survived accurately in the sources remains debated, but the intention is undeniable. Remind the enslaved that they were prey. Inside this machinery, punishment was preventive. A boy did not need to steal to learn pain. He was starved so he would steal and be punished if caught. A woman did not need to betray her city to feel fear. She needed only to imagine her son returning without honor. The inspection of infants was not isolated brutality. It was the opening act in a lifelong performance of discipline. From cradle to grave, the Spartan citizen was conditioned to believe that survival depended on suppressing instinct, suppressing doubt, suppressing compassion. Love was dangerous, curiosity was risky, weakness was fail. And always Taygetus stood above them. Criminals were thrown from its cliffs, traitors vanished along its ridges, rejected infants were said to be left on its slopes, exposed to wind and cold. Modern archaeology has complicated the legend. Bones found in certain chasms belong mostly to adult men, not babies. But the symbolism endured. The mountain did not need to prove every story true. It only needed to be feared. It only needed to exist as a place where the state could send you and from which you might not return. Sparta called this order. It called it honor. It called it the price of greatness. But beneath the discipline lay insecurity so profound that it reshaped childhood, marriage, motherhood, even death. And if this was how Sparta treated its own citizens in the name of stability, the question grows darker with every step deeper into its rituals. What did it do when obedience faltered? And who was truly safe in a society built on permanent war against itself? They called it a festival. They called it sacred. But at the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys learned that silence was more valuable than life. By the time a Spartan boy reached adolescence, fear was no longer an emotion, it was training. The agoge had stripped him of comfort, thinned his body with hunger, toughened his skin against cold, and taught him that being caught in weakness was worse than being hurt. Yet all of that was preparation for something far more theatrical, something designed not merely to test endurance, but to transform suffering into public doctrine. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, one of the oldest religious sites in Laconia, punishment became ceremony. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Xenophon describe the ritual with disturbing calm, as if they were documenting athletic contests rather than calculated brutality. Boys were ordered to approach the altar, where offerings were placed, sometimes cheese, sometimes sacred tokens, and as they advanced, older youths, armed with whips, struck them with full force. The objective was not to stop them. The objective was to measure how long they could endure pain without breaking. The whips were not symbolic. They tore skin. They split flesh. Roman observers later wrote of blood running down the stone steps, pooling at the base of the altar until the limestone darkened permanently. Archaeologists excavating the site centuries later uncovered layers of iron-rich residue embedded deep within the porous rock, chemical traces consistent with repeated exposure to human blood. The altar did not simply witness suffering, it absorbed it. The crowd gathered not in horror, but in expectation. Mothers and fathers stood among neighbors. Foreign travelers came to observe what had become a grim attraction in the ancient world. Even Cicero, the Roman statesman, recorded seeing Spartan youths endure lashes without a sound, praising their composure even as he admitted the spectacle unsettled him. The boys understood the stakes. To cry out was shame. To collapse too soon was disgrace. To die without uttering a sound was triumph. Imagine the psychology. A child conditioned since 7 to equate silence with honor stands before an altar dedicated to a goddess and learns that divinity requires blood. The first strike steals breath. The second ignites nerve endings like fire. By the 10th, the mind fractures into survival instinct and drilled obedience. Around him, the city watches, not to intervene, but to evaluate. This was not private discipline, it was social filtration. Sparta did not merely want strong soldiers, it wanted citizens who believed pain purified them. The altar ritual served as spectacle and warning. Every lash whispered the same message: your body is expendable, your endurance is currency, and your value depends on how convincingly you pretend not to feel. Historians debate how frequently boys died during the ritual, but ancient sources acknowledge that fatalities were not rare. Plutarch writes of youths who expired under the blows, praised as martyrs to discipline. Death was reframed as proof of perfection. The cruelty was masked as devotion. The crowd's applause transformed agony into aspiration. It was not enough to survive, one had to suffer beautifully. This inversion of instinct, celebrating what the body rejects, was Sparta's greatest innovation. Other Greek cities trained soldiers. Sparta engineered reflexive obedience. It trained its young not simply to fight enemies, but to distrust their own fear. And yet, beneath the ritual's theatrical brutality lurked something colder. The altar was not about bravery alone, it was about surveillance. In a society terrified of internal revolt, the state needed to know which boys could endure orders without hesitation, which would suppress instinct, suppress empathy, suppress the urge to protest injustice. The whipping ceremony functioned as early selection, filtering potential weakness long before the battlefield. In this sense, Artemis Orthia was less temple and more laboratory. Blood was data, silence was proof. As the final lashes fell and another boy staggered away, alive or dead, the crowd dispersed, satisfied that tradition had been honored. But tradition in Sparta was rarely ancient by accident. It was maintained because it worked. Every ritual reinforced hierarchy. Every scar told a story of loyalty, and every boy who survived left knowing one irreversible truth: pain was not the enemy, exposure of pain was. Yet even as the altar darkened with centuries of sacrifice, another question lingered beneath the stone. If Sparta demanded silence from its sons at the altar, what did it demand from its daughters in the home? And how far would the state go to ensure that even love itself obeyed the whip? They said Spartan women were the freest in Greece. They said they owned land, spoke boldly, and birthed warriors. But freedom in Sparta was never a gift, it was a tool. The legend of the Spartan woman has survived longer than many of the men she raised. Ancient writers repeated it with fascination. Women who exercised in public, who owned property, who answered foreign diplomats without lowering their eyes, who told their sons to return from war with your shield or on it. Compared to Athenian wives confined behind walls and veils, Spartan women appeared powerful, almost revolutionary. Aristotle himself remarked on the unusual level of economic influence Spartan women held. Yet when examined beneath the surface, that freedom begins to resemble something more controlled, more calculated, more dangerous. Spartan women were not liberated for their own sake, they were optimized. Their strength was not celebrated because they were valued as individuals, it was cultivated because Sparta needed stronger sons. From childhood, girls were trained not in weaving or quiet obedience, but in running, wrestling, discus throwing. Plutarch explains the reasoning without disguise. Strong mothers produce strong children. The female body was state infrastructure. Exercise was not empowerment, it was agricultural preparation. The womb was soil, and the state intended to harvest soldiers. Marriage itself reflected this philosophy with unsettling clarity. The wedding ritual did not begin with music or procession, but with transformation. The bride's head was shaved, stripping away her identity, her beauty, the cultural marker that defined womanhood across Greece. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, left alone in a dark room without ceremony. The husband arrived at night, often after dining with his military mess, and departed before dawn. Plutarch later romanticized this secrecy as a method to preserve desire, but the darker reading is unavoidable. The ritual disrupted attachment. It ensured that loyalty to barracks came before loyalty to bed. Young couples could live for years without daylight intimacy. A husband might father children before ever seeing his wife's face fully illuminated. The relationship was structured around reproduction, not companionship. Emotional distance was policy. In a city where the state feared divided loyalties, even marriage had to be managed like a military maneuver. And if reproduction failed, the intervention was clinical. Xenophon and Plutarch both describe arrangements where husbands considered physically inferior were encouraged or compelled to allow stronger men to impregnate their wives. The objective was clear: produce better offspring. Consent was irrelevant. Children belonged to Sparta, not to parents. The woman's body was a corridor through which future soldiers passed. Failure carried consequences no less severe than the lash at Artemis Orthia. A woman who produced only daughters felt the quiet erosion of status. Daughters were necessary, but sons were currency. With each female birth, whispers grew sharper. Spartan women were granted voices, but those voices were often sharpened into weapons against one another. The culture rewarded public shaming of cowardice. Mothers were expected to disown sons who fled battle. Stories recorded by Plutarch describe women who cursed surviving sons for returning alive without honor. Whether every tale is literal or embellished, the message was unmistakable. Love must bow to the state. Grief must be silenced. A mother who wept for a coward was treated not as compassionate, but as disloyal. This was the golden leash. Spartan women possessed property and public presence, but those privileges existed only as long as they fulfilled their reproductive function. They had something to lose: status, influence, social belonging, and that vulnerability ensured compliance. Sparta understood something chilling about human psychology. It is easier to control those who believe they are privileged. Remove visible chains and replace them with honor, and captivity becomes invisible. The Spartan wife who shamed a weak man was enforcing the same system that would one day judge her. She became both instrument and subject of control. Beneath the pride and rhetoric, the insecurity of Sparta pulsed. A society terrified of revolt could not afford emotional bonds stronger than civic duty. Women were given strength to birth warriors, boldness to discipline men, and property to manage absent husbands, but never freedom to choose a life outside the system. Their power ended where the state's needs began. And below them, in the shadows of estates and fields, lived women who possessed no illusion of privilege at all, helot women, whose suffering was not gilded in honor, but etched plainly in fear. If this was how Sparta shaped its wives and mothers, the next question cuts deeper. What did it do to the women it considered disposable? And how far could a civilization go when even marriage itself was designed as a weapon? The Night of the Helots. Every autumn, Sparta declared war on the people who fed it. Murder became legal, mercy became weakness, and in the darkness, young Spartans were sent hunting. If the altar of Artemis Orthia revealed how Sparta treated its sons, the fields beyond the city revealed how it treated those it depended on. The Helots were not foreign captives recently taken in battle. They were entire populations enslaved generations earlier when Sparta conquered Messenia and reduced its inhabitants to hereditary servitude. They farmed the fertile plains of Laconia, harvested grain, tended livestock, and delivered fixed portions of produce to their Spartan masters. Without them, the agoge would collapse, the barracks would starve, and the warrior elite would be forced to labor with their own hands, a humiliation Sparta could not tolerate. This dependence bred not gratitude, but terror. The Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens many times over. They remembered freedom. They passed down stories of lost homelands. They waited. And Sparta, haunted by that waiting, turned paranoia into ritual. Each year, according to ancient sources like Plutarch and Aristotle, the ephors, the highest magistrates in Sparta, formally declared war on the Helots. It was a chilling legal maneuver. By announcing a state of war, any Spartan could kill a Helot without religious pollution or legal consequence. It was not called murder, it was called warfare. The declaration did not signal open battle, it authorized perpetual fear. A helot walking afield at dusk could be struck down without explanation. A family sleeping in a rural hut could lose a father before dawn, and there would be no trial, no accusation, no justice. Violence became atmospheric, unpredictable, constant, instructive. Some of the most disturbing accounts describe a practice later known as the crypteia. Young Spartan men, often in the later stages of the agoge, were sent into the countryside armed with daggers and minimal provisions. Their task was not conventional combat, it was surveillance and assassination. They were instructed to kill helots who appeared strong, outspoken, or capable of leadership. The objective was preemptive elimination. Sparta did not wait for rebellion to erupt, it thinned potential resistance before it could organize. Thucydides records an episode during the Peloponnesian War when thousands of helots who had distinguished themselves in service were promised freedom, only to disappear shortly afterward. No records, no bodies returned, simply absence. The silence surrounding their fate became its own warning. Humiliation was institutionalized. Myron of Priene and later Athenaeus describe helots forced to wear caps of dogskin, visible markers of inferiority. They were subjected to scheduled beatings regardless of behavior. Punishment not for action, but for existence. Children of Spartan citizens were shown intoxicated helots, men compelled to drink undiluted wine until they staggered, so that the spectacle of degradation could serve as moral instruction. Look at them, the lesson implied. This is what happens to those without discipline. The cruelty was theatrical, but the message was strategic. Dehumanize the helots publicly, and you justify their treatment privately. For helot women, vulnerability deepened. They labored in fields and households without legal protection. Their bodies were exposed not only to toil, but to exploitation, a reality ancient sources imply without always stating directly. In a society where even Spartan wives were reduced to reproductive function, helot women existed outside the boundaries of honor altogether. They bore children who inherited servitude. They raised infants knowing the state that enslaved them could erase their families without consequence. Fear became inheritance. Sparta called this stability. It framed terror as necessity. A small elite ruling a vast enslaved majority believed constant pressure was the only barrier against annihilation. Insecurity justified brutality. The annual declaration of war was less about combat than about psychology. It reminded every helot that freedom was a rumor, and every Spartan that dominance required vigilance. Punishment did not respond to threat, it manufactured obedience before threat could materialize. And yet, beneath the rigid discipline, cracks appeared. History preserves one moment that exposes Sparta's greatest fear. During wartime, desperate for manpower, the state offered freedom to helots who demonstrated exceptional bravery. 2,000 stepped forward, believing courage might purchase liberty. They were crowned with garlands, they were paraded publicly, they were congratulated, and then, without explanation, they vanished. Ancient historian Thucydides writes of their disappearance with restrained horror, noting that no one knew precisely how they were removed, only that none were seen again. Sparta had perfected control through fear, but fear breeds curiosity. If courage could not earn freedom, what could? And if a state must silence 2,000 men at once to preserve its illusion of strength, what does that reveal about the fragility beneath its armor? In the final reckoning, the greatest brutality of Sparta may not have been the whip, or the cliff, or the dagger in the night. It may have been the lie that obedience guaranteed survival. The 2,000 who believed. They were promised freedom, they were crowned for bravery, and then, without a scream, they disappeared. By the time Sparta offered liberty to 2,000 helots, the city was exhausted by war and haunted by numbers. Thucydides records the moment with unsettling restraint. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta announced that any Helot who had shown exceptional courage in battle could step forward and claim emancipation. It was a calculated gesture dressed in honor. For generations, Helots had fought beside Spartan soldiers when summoned, carrying shields, building fortifications, absorbing risk without reward. Now the state dangled what had always been denied: freedom. Imagine the tension in the fields when the announcement spread. Hope is more dangerous than fear. Fear keeps a population quiet. Hope makes it move. 2,000 men came forward, not 200, not a cautious handful, 2,000. They believed bravery might outweigh birth, that loyalty in war might rewrite status in peace. Sparta responded with ceremony. The chosen were crowned with garlands. They were paraded publicly, praised for valor, displayed as proof that the system rewarded merit. For a brief moment, it appeared as though the rigid architecture of Spartan society might bend. Perhaps courage could transcend slavery. Perhaps discipline was not reserved for citizens alone. The spectacle soothed anxiety among Helots and reassured Spartans that control remained intact. It was theater, and then the curtain fell. Thucydides writes that shortly afterward, the 2,000 vanished. No official account of their execution survives. No battlefield, no trial, no recorded decree. Simply absence. He notes, with the cold precision of a historian who understood the weight of implication, that no one knew exactly how they were removed. In a city where thousands lived within sight of one another daily, where anonymity was rare, 2,000 men ceased to exist without public explanation. The silence was deliberate. It did not need detail. The message was clear. Courage would never be allowed to challenge hierarchy. Why eliminate the very men who had proven loyalty? Because Sparta's fear ran deeper than any battlefield threat. A Helot who believed freedom was possible became unpredictable. A Helot who tasted recognition might demand consistency. In a society constructed on permanent inequality, even the illusion of upward movement threatened structural collapse. The disappearance of the 2,000 was not random cruelty. It was preemptive containment. Sparta rewarded obedience as long as it remained dependent. The moment obedience became confident, it became dangerous. This was the final layer of the system you have witnessed, from the unnamed infant judged unfit, to boys bleeding at Artemis Orthia, to women bound by golden expectations, to Helots hunted under legal war. Every punishment served a single purpose: suppress instability before it surfaced. Sparta perfected discipline not because it was fearless, but because it was terrified. Terrified of rebellion, terrified of weakness, terrified that if the machinery stopped even briefly, the valley would erupt. Modern archaeology has complicated some legends. The chasm at Taygetus contains mostly adult male remains, not infants hurled en masse as once believed. Certain rituals may have evolved or intensified under Roman fascination. Yet these corrections do not soften the core truth. Ancient sources from Plutarch to Xenophon to Thucydides agree on the structure. Sparta engineered obedience through relentless, public, and normalized punishment. The city without walls was not a symbol of strength, it was an environment of constant exposure. Reputation replaced chains, ceremony replaced compassion, silence replaced grief. And what remains centuries later is not only the story of brutality, but the question it leaves behind. Sparta admired strength above all else. It told mothers to prefer dead sons over dishonored ones. It told boys that pain was proof of worth. It told slaves that loyalty would be noticed until it was not. but a civilization that must eliminate 2,000 loyal men to preserve order reveals something profound. It does not trust its own myth. In the end, Sparta conquered many enemies, but it never conquered its fear. It built a society where punishment was oxygen, where discipline was religion, and where hope itself could be executed. The mountain still stands, the altar stones still bear invisible stains, and the silence of the 2,000 echoes longer than any Spartan victory.